Welcome to episode 258 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/258. Before we get started, I want to mention that I'm currently taking on new clients. I specialize in helping clients overcome eating disorders and disordered eating, chronic dieting, body dissatisfaction and poor body image, exercise compulsion and over-exercising, and also helping clients to regain their period. So if you want help in any of these areas, or you simply want support in improving your relationship with food and with body and exercise, then please get in contact. You can head over to seven-health.com/help, and you can then read about how I work with clients and apply for a free initial chat there. The address again is seven-health.com/help, and I'll also include that in the show notes. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist that specializes in recovery from disordered eating and eating disorders, and really helping anyone who has a messy relationship with food and body and exercise. And today on the show, it is a guest interview, and today my guest is Katja Rowell. Katja is an MD, an author and childhood feeding specialist, described as academic but warm and down to earth. Her mission is to help children do their best with eating and feel good in their bodies. She has a special interest in anxious and avoidant eating, food preoccupation, and supporting foster and adopted children. She also helps parents feed their children with a focus on relationship and felt safety, and supporting attunement with internal cues. Along with a multidisciplinary team, she is developing responsive feeding therapy for feeding and eating challenges. And her books include Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating, Conquer Picky Eating for Teens and Adults, and Love Me, Feed Me. So I became aware of Katja through hearing her on a podcast, and I then bought her book, Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating, and loved it. And so I decided to invite her on the show. And this episode is directed much more at parents and the feeding of children. And while the book I read was about picky eating, this isn't the sole focus of our discussion, because even without a picky eater, there can be worries about not eating enough vegetables or not enough protein, or there can be worries about kids eating too much food and needing to police this. And so this really looks at a wide variety of worries that come up with feeding children and how to approach mealtime. And even if you don't have kids, I still think this is a useful listen, because you can reflect on your own childhood and how you were raised and the kind of food environment in your home, or you can listen to it and think about how you currently feed yourself, because what is being recommended here for children equally applies for adults. And so we can take these ideas and we can turn them inwards. And during the conversation, we reference Ellyn and the division of responsibility, but we never talk about it in detail. And it is something that I cover in much more detail during my conversation with Paige Smathers, which is episode 150 of the podcast, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But just a brief overview of the division of responsibility, if you've never heard of this before. With a parent and a child relationship, the parent and child have different responsibilities when it comes to eating. And as the parent, the responsibilities are to choose what food is available. So what is going to be offered for the meal or snack. It's the parent's decision about when to eat, so when to provide these eating opportunities. And it's the parent's responsibility to decide where. So at the dinner table, in the car, at the park, wherever. And obviously you're wanting to do this in a supportive way. So providing food options in which the child will at least like some of what is on offer, and providing eating opportunities at intervals of time that are appropriate for the child. But those are the responsibilities of the parent, the what, the where and the when. And then the responsibilities of the child is to decide which of the foods on offer they want to eat and how much of these foods to eat. And so they can decide to eat none of the foods and therefore have nothing to eat, or they can also decide to have one of the options but have lots of that one thing. And so that is a very simple overview of the division of responsibility. We talk about it in more detail in this episode, but we didn't actually outline the role specifically, so I just want to make it clear here. And I highly suggest the book Child of Mine by Ellyn, which Katja recommends, and I've read it and I recommend it to parents all the time. As part of the conversation, we chat about how Katja got into doing this work. We cover responsive feeding therapy and the values associated with this, the frequency of feeding issues and what typical eating looks like, what typical growth looks like, the mechanics of eating, the importance of temperament and understanding how children are different. And then we cover the 5 steps that are outlined in the book for creating a healthy feeding relationship and addressing if there are any different feeding issues. And during the episode, I share a lot about my own upbringing and my own picky eating, and also how we navigate eating at home with my son Ramsey. Towards the end of the episode, I make reference to an attachment book that I love but was blanking on the title. And the title is called Attachment Play: How to Solve Children's Behavior Problems with Play, Laughter and Connection by Alethea J. Suter, PhD. And I will link to that in the show notes. I will be back at the end with a recommendation for you, but for now, let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Katja Rowell. Hey Katja, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks for chatting with me today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so you are the author of Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed. And so I think a lot of the content of this conversation will be stuff that is covered in the book and just kind of using the book as a jumping off point. But before we get into that, I'd love to just chat more about you and your background and how you got into doing the work that you're doing. So I guess as a starting place, do you want to give listeners a bit of background on yourself, like who you are, what you do, what training you've done, that kind of thing?
Sure. So I am a family doctor by training, and I've been working in the feeding world now for almost 15 years. I certainly did not go to medical school thinking I would be focusing on this. And I think the way a lot of people have big life changes. I had a child, and I quickly realized that I knew pretty well what I was supposed to feed her, but I was quite lost with how to feed her. Yeah. She was nearly 10 pounds at birth after an uncomplicated pregnancy, just a fourth generation 9 to 10 pound baby. So we were a little prepared, but that was right around the time when the sort of panic around childhood weight and the attention on that was ramping up. And I had this baby that was off the charts. And I had also I worked also in college health for a while. So I had seen the devastation of eating disorders and also seen in my general practice adults who really struggled with their relationship with food in their bodies. And I was just overcome with this anxiety feeding my own child, and sort of feeling like, how do I navigate this? And family and people saying, oh, you're making her, I don't even like to use the O word, but, hide her bottle, you're making her obese, and all of these different messages. And so I ended up having a food preoccupied toddler who followed me around the house, signing for food all day long. And I was just completely worried and anxious and feeding her from that place of fear and anxiety of, I don't want her to struggle with weight, body image, eating disorder, but having no idea what to do. And so when she was 14 months, we were at an airport and she was inhaling this little boy's snack. And I sort of said, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. And the woman said, well, I'm a pediatric dietitian and you should read Ellyn Satter's book, Child of Mine. And so I read it, and it was very reassuring. And so I did this division of responsibility at home. And within a few weeks, it was a complete transformation in how she related to food. She was sort of free to be a toddler again. And it just freed up so much anxiety and worry and allowed us to connect. And it was so transformative. That was it. I had to learn more about this. And so I ended up with Ellyn Satter's clinical faculty for a few years, and then branching out to talk to occupational therapists and speech therapists and psychologists and eating disorder people and reading. And so just deepening that learning and working with families then. So that, it's a personal story. It was this just sort of this crushing humility of, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as a family doctor, I'd been giving feeding advice. So that's a whole other thing we can talk about, is how the first line of people out there that are supposed to help parents often don't know what they're doing and can do real harm. But so, yeah, it was a personal entryway into this work, and I've just been so grateful for it.
Nice. And so what about, like, if you talked about your daughter being the one that kind of got you into this, if we go back to you as a child, like what was your relationship with food like, and how was feeding in your home?
Yeah, so I'm my mother's German, so we moved to the U.S. when I was 3, and so every meal pretty much was home cooked, and there was a sense of, we don't eat that crap, McDonald's and restaurants and takeout, and it was frugal and health as well. And so I was the kid with the pressed German seed bread that people thought was chocolate, and but and so I had lots of family meals that I remember very fondly. But I do definitely remember, particularly in middle school, as my body went from this lean sort of, I ran under a 6-minute mile when I was 11 in cross country, and I was super sort of fit and lean. And then puberty came and my body changed, and then suddenly it was comments like, do you really need another pork chop? And so there were definitely messages I was getting around my changing body that made me not feel super great about it. I would go to friends' houses and eat an entire bag of Doritos or have, some of those forbidden foods. But I think relatively unscathed. I think there was enough of a scaffolding and early that, and with my genetic predisposition or whatever else, I would say overall I was a mildly restrictive eater through my adult years. I don't know. I'm sure you do content warnings about diets and stuff, but I did, I tried to diet and lose some weight for my wedding. And then I tried a few years later where we did some, I don't know what it was, South Beach or something like that, where I was just obsessed with that bowl of cereal I wasn't allowed to have. And so, pretty restricted, and really, the shift to me was seeing my daughter's capability, seeing this kid who was completely food preoccupied, then, who loved ice cream, at some point hand me an ice cream and say, I'm done. And just sort of thinking, well, if she can do it, maybe I need to learn some more about this. And so it was really through watching her capability emerge that I then tested it for myself, and I allowed myself permission. And so I bought the Cheetos, and anything covered in that sort of orange cheesy powder was something I always felt out of control with. And so I bought Doritos and I bought Coke, and for a long time I'd have a Coke every day at lunch, or I'd eat the bag. And then fairly quickly, with that permission mindset and a lot of learning and listening around some of my own thoughts about weight and health, those foods lost their power over me. And so, I have a teenager now, and we have all of these foods at home, and sometimes a Coke really hits the spot and I'll have it. But the bag of Doritos might be finished, or it might sit in the pantry for 3 weeks and we have to throw it out. So really, again, like I think about this fairly often, like had I not had a child in a bigger body, I think I would still be restricting today myself, and probably I know given her personality, we would have just had so many more struggles. So just this gratitude for having found this work for her and myself. So yeah, it's an interesting journey. And as now I head towards 50 next year, my body's changing again, and it's bigger, even though I am far more fit and active than I was 20 years ago, and I'm healthier than I was then. I feel overall better. But so that's also an adjustment. And my husband joked to me, he said, well, now you get to practice what you preach. So as my body changes, I'm like, that's fair. So, that's probably more than you wanted to know, but I try to approach a lot of this with curiosity, and as those messages come in, and I live in this culture where we're still inundated with this, and as my body changes, and helping to sort of shepherd a almost 17-year-old through our culture, it's humbling, but I've been really grateful to have found this work.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, what you described there is actually often what happens when clients are coming to me, and I work now mostly with eating disorders, but there is this awareness for a lot of the parents where I have this relationship with food and I do not want to pass it on to my child. And I want to work out a way of how I can heal myself, but also be the role model that I want my child to have. And I think like children are great in that way of wanting or making you want to be better. And I've got a 5-year-old son, and I don't have issues around food. That's never been something that I've personally struggled with, but there's a lot of things that is helping me to figure out about myself and making me a better person. And so, yeah, I can definitely, there's definitely similarities there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. For sure. Just, as everyone says, your children are your best teachers. And it's quite a journey. And sometimes we're willing to explore things or challenge things or work on boundaries for our children where we were not maybe willing to extend that same kindness to ourselves. And that's a whole other topic. But I think that children can really motivate and raise the anxiety. So and we're parenting also in this public era of judgment. And so it's super complicated, all of it. But yeah, it's definitely wanting to do better for our children is a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And as you like being an MD and then finding out about this kind of work, and as you say, you don't want to use the O word, I imagine you've found out about health at every size and all of this, like a lot of that is going against what you've been trained and what a lot of other people who are practicing as MDs talk about. And so how is that for you? What are the struggles? What do you come up against because of this?
Yeah, and again, it really pains me to say, had I not had a child in a bigger body, I'm not sure I would have been open to listening to this. I also have a husband who's bigger, and I suppose I'm bigger now as well. But yeah, it's so difficult. Again, my family of origin, very thin, very much equating fatness with just if everyone ate the way we did, everyone would be thin kind of thing. So there's a lot of judgment and moralizing around it that I grew up with. And then the medical training 100% reinforces that. And so, one thing I would say to those listening and that I share with folks is that it took me a couple of years of really listening to people, reading people online, having conversations with fat people and fat activists, and digging into the research, because I can tell you I remember the first time I heard, say you can be fat and fit, and sitting there with my colleagues sort of having a good laugh at that, which, is embarrassing. But we're almost trained in the medical profession to believe that fatness, weight, and badness are linearly related. Like every pound is 10 minutes off your life kind of relationship. And it just is not. But it took me a couple of years of reading the research that we just weren't exposed to, and listening to people's stories and following my discomfort and my dissonance. So when I had a really strong reaction to something, or, well, that's not right, that study says this, or that's where I challenged myself to learn more. And when I thought back to my time practicing as a physician, I mean, I think this is kind of it's such an opportunity, because when I practiced a weight-centered model, it was awful. It felt awful. It felt awful to patients, felt awful to the children. It didn't work. I was nagging and sort of cheerleading, and it was deeply unsatisfying. And I didn't believe my patients when they would tell me things. I thought they were just not being compliant. I was the typical weight bias doctor, and profoundly contributed to my job dissatisfaction. And this health at every size model, and promoting, more tuned in eating, and just that whole looking at behaviors and wellness rather than weight, it actually, I believe, is more effective in terms of improved health outcomes, and people feel better. And it just, you're on the same side as your patient, and it's not this sort of paternalistic, do as I say, and now you're not, and it's your fault. And it just, this model feels so much better. But the challenge is that our culture is still barreling in the other direction. And so the challenge is that it takes time to challenge those beliefs and do that reading and learning. And that's, there has to be space for that, but while also recognizing, if you're parenting children, that it's really confusing and really scary process in this culture that we live in.
Yeah, totally. And I think it does feel like the tide is turning a little bit, but I also can see at the dieting end of the spectrum, things are also getting more extreme there as well. And so, yeah, I do think it's going to take some time. And also, like, I only have one child, but I know for some people, having more than one child is also, or can also be helpful in this, in just seeing how different their eating styles are and just seeing how different their body shape is. Even though they come from the same parents, they are just very different human beings. And I think sometimes that can be at least a little bit of a light bulb moment for someone if they have that experience.
Absolutely. And I just shared, with permission, a picture on Instagram of twins where one at age sort of 9 is a good 6 or 8 inches taller. And, they're obviously, they're not identical twins, but these, to your example, they're twins. And one is 5th percentile and the other's 90th percentile, and, roughly. And so that's just really powerful, that we can feed children the same foods, the same household, the same birth order, really, and their bodies are just going to look different. And I feel like this has been this real disservice of this focus on higher weight, and the growth chart. It's like a report card now for parents. And there are so many misperceptions around children's growth. And often, if you look at the chart, it looks like it's a smooth line and children really should stay on the line. But when you look at data from, age 0 to 5, the majority of children are actually moving around potentially quite a bit on the chart. So, 2/3, I believe, under 6 months will move more than 2 of those big lines on the chart and be perfectly healthy. The most of them will be perfectly healthy. And so obviously, if there are changes in growth, it's important to look at, but if you do a full history and physical and the child is otherwise well, and it's sort of slow movement on the, not something abrupt that's happening, and you do a history and physical and things are good, it's likely just to be that child's growth pattern. But instead, what I see so often is if there's a little bit of a rise or a little bit of a dip. I'm not talking weight loss. I'm just saying, just maybe for a little while there's no weight gain, and then it's like, ooh, you've fallen off your growth curve. Whereas if they waited 6 months, they would have shot up an inch and gained 5 pounds, kind of thing. So I see so often this, like, here's your BMI, or here's the kid's percentile, and it's 20th percentile. And then everyone thinks, oh, that's underweight. Every child should be 50th percentile. So really profound misperceptions on the part of parents and even practitioners around weight and growth that I think sets off a lot of intervention and worry and suffering that is just completely unnecessary. And that's kind of one of my big missions with this work, is like, where can I reassure parents? Where can we get off that cycle and just decrease this needless suffering?
Yeah. And this is something you kind of said a number of times through the book, of like, it's not just about growth. It's like, okay, what are they like from a development standpoint? What are they like from a happiness standpoint? How is their other health? Like all of these other things that need to be taken into consideration when starting to look at, okay, is this something that needs further attention? Or is this something that's actually just, this is where this kid is at? Absolutely.
And I feel like we've lost looking at the child for the chart. And, I've had, so right now, 85th percentile, for example, is the cutoff for overweight. And anytime I say those words, it's in quotes. So I have to say them because that's what the parents will hear. But, and there are also ethnic differences. And so I've had parents say, okay, my child bumped up to 86th percentile. And it was like this for 2 years, the doctor saying, oh, he's overweight and you have to get him to eat less and move more. And the parents saying, well, this kid's in 2 sports, he's active, sleeping well, eating well. It's a completely arbitrary number, half a pound or a pound or an eighth of an inch that kicks someone into one of these arbitrary cutoffs. There's just no real life urgency around these changes that suddenly a kid who was 84th percentile, who's now 86th percentile, that does not come along with an actual risk that the label implies. And so again, if all we're doing, and I see this unfortunately very often, is for whatever reason, a kid bumps up into or down into one of these labels now. And now we've turned children's bodies into problems to solve and parents making them responsible. And it just doesn't work that way. And again, all of my caveats, if there are times when weight is going up or down where we need to, look into it. But I see so many of the kids I work with where I believe they're mislabeled. It's a misperception around growth, and that kicks them into these problems that can go on for years.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many clients that I work with where their history starts out because they were taken to Weight Watchers, or their history starts out because of some kind of intervention in a situation where actually there really wasn't anything that needed to be done. They were a perfectly happy, healthy child, and the messaging and the advice that was given then kickstarts something that is a real lifelong struggle.
Absolutely. And that just deeply upsets me. And I see this, and this is why I try to talk to parents too about some of this anticipatory guidance around something like puberty. And that pre-puberty growth is a very much at-risk time. I imagine many of your clients, this might have happened when they were 10 or 11. And the growth pattern in preparation for puberty is to usually put on a bit of weight before the height growth spurt. And some kids will put on weight and they'll stay in bigger bodies, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we're looking at typical growth patterns and labeling them as pathological. And, so many kiddos, if at 10 and 11, that's what their bodies are supposed to do in preparation for puberty and their growth spurt, is to get a little bit soft and rounder tummies, and particularly for girls, adding fat. And this is such a panic point for so many parents. And fueling the flames is often the doctor's office and those darn labels. So yeah, that's a dangerous time that I tend to ask parents to be aware. We also know that Black girls in general will go into puberty earlier, about a year earlier than white and Hispanic girls. And so that's something to be aware of. You might see that around age 8 or 9. And so a lot of this is just information and reassurance to not get into unnecessary and harmful interventions.
Yeah. So let's chat about your book, which is helping your child with extreme picky eating. So the title, and throughout the book, you use extreme picky eating. So do you want to describe or define what this means? Sure.
Yeah. So there's a lot of sort of talk in the child feeding world also about the word picky, and some people say, we shouldn't use it. It has negative connotations, and that's fair. And so one can say picky, moving with professionals and some parents now to talk about avoidant or anxious eating. I personally don't see any judgment in picky, but some folks say fussy or selective. So anyway, we called it that because, and I wrote it with my co-author, Jenny McLaughlin, runs a feeding therapy practice. She's a speech pathologist at UT Dallas. So we called it that because this is what parents said. And so, remember when I said I started this work and I then had to learn more because I would go and do workshops on starting solids and picky eating, and parents every time one or two said, well, this all sounds fine for my other kids or my friends' kids, but I have an extreme picky eater. Our situation is more extreme. And so it's an umbrella term for really anytime a child is eating so little in their amount or variety that it impacts their physical or social or emotional development, or if it's worrying the parents. And that's the piece where we're a bit different than some of the feeding disorder labels or how they talk about that, because parent anxiety, even if it's a typical picky eater, puts that family at risk for getting into more of those counterproductive struggles. So it's really, if your child can't go to a sleepover because they're worried they won't have food there that they can enjoy, or if they have a lot of anxiety if there's a food on the table that's a non-preferred food. Often this goes along with sensory processing differences. It's much more common in autistic children or neurodivergent children. And I often see it also in children who are smaller than average. So it's often a combination of different things. Important to note, if there was anything that made eating at any point in an infant, toddler's life painful or difficult, uncomfortable, that makes this problem more likely. So if an infant had reflux or had, spent time in the NICU with, a breathing tube or things in their mouth, that can make the mouth very hypersensitive to stimuli. So it's actually a lot of different things coming in. And certainly if there are medical reasons or anatomical reasons, that can play a role too.
Okay. And you said it's more likely if a child is on the smaller side. Does this also mean it's more likely if a child is premature or not necessarily?
Yes, we do see it more commonly also with premature infants. And that's hard to tease out. Is it also because we might tend to see more sensory processing differences? Also, especially if they're quite early, there are difficulties in coordinating, breathing, sucking, and swallowing. And there's also a lot of attention to their weight and growth and how much they're eating. And so, when I did my rotations in the pediatric hospital, these kids were referred to as feeders and growers. And so right from the start, there's this intense focus on how much they're eating. And I've had parents where I've worked with them where they've been discharged from the hospital and told, do whatever you have to get X number of ounces into this child. And so there's a lot of anxiety on the part of parents and often a lot of effort, and parents who are really under-supported in terms of, a responsive approach to feeding. And so I've had parents really desperate, getting into some desperate situations around child only feeds while asleep, or, one dad was clamping the baby's head down and sort of trying to force the bottle in out of just terror that she was not eating and would end up with a feeding tube. And meanwhile, then, the baby's sputtering and coughing, and that's a scary experience because she's protecting her airway. So we can see sometimes where this fear and then unsupported parents might fall into coercive feeding or trying to get kids to eat where the children don't want to. And then we can see a protective response come out of that. So it's complicated, and to me, the bottom line is parents need far more support than they're getting, whatever the problem is.
Yeah. And I guess the sort of overarching message or your focus with the book is like the real importance of a healthy feeding relationship. And there's obviously a lot more nuance and there's stuff that we'll go into. But for me, that was kind of like the overarching kind of takeaway from the book of like just how important the relationship piece is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it also, and on my feeding journey, it was important also to understand that research is pretty darn clear that the harder parents work to try to get kids to eat more or less, as was my case, that the worse children eat. And so, I think parents are often left, if they have a child who seems to not want to eat or anxious or avoidant, they feel like, well, I have to get them to eat. And so we can get into the bribing, the begging, the sticker charts, the rewards, the removing video games, all of these things. And it feels like parents feel like, well, my only choice is I either make him eat or he doesn't eat. And that's just not the case. And so I think that, understanding that trying to get kids to eat or not eat and overriding their cues and their autonomy will make them eat worse and grow less well. That's sort of the first piece of the puzzle is, okay. And in a way that's very reassuring to parents. So, okay, yeah. I don't have to have these battles. I don't have to work so hard. I don't have to, have my toddler in a headlock to get that one bite of, carrot in. And so I think that it's a reassuring message, but then it feels very scary because it's like, okay, well then, so what do I do instead? If I can't push them or restrict them, that's often where the advice then falls apart for parents.
Yeah. There's not the kind of the practical next steps.
Right.
And so what you're describing is that responsive feeding therapy? Is because I know there is that overarching term, and I know you also have a website that or a platform that you're part of called Responsive Feeding Therapy Pro. And so, is that what this kind of method is?
Yes, it is. And it's based on responsive feeding, which is, it's that feeding relationship. And what's wonderful about it is that feeding kids this way brings you closer together. And we all want to be close with our children. We don't want to be fighting or dreading mealtimes. And so it really is about supporting that relationship first and that child's felt safety, that child, if we can get a bite of mushy peas down, but it's a 45-minute meltdown, we've really lost any of the nutritional benefit of that. So the wonderful thing is that by, having children coming to eating times as much in a calm body and calm mind that is open to relationships, they will tend to eat better. It supports having that calm body supports health. They have their heart and blood vessels, blood pressure's better. They're not flooded with stress hormones. Their insulin and cortisol, which helps store energy, is working better. Their immune system works better. They can actually tune in better to appetite and hunger cues instead of the battle. And so then they can tune into their body and curiosity around maybe trying a new food. So yes, it's all part of that responsive feeding therapy. And there are 5 values. I can talk about those later. But yeah, it's really a whole approach that is relationship building. And it really does feel better to practice as a parent.
Yeah. And definitely I want to touch on the values because I think that would be useful to have a conversation around. How common are feeding issues? Like what are the stats on this?
Well, about a third of parents will ask their healthcare provider for help with feeding. And again, this is the real travesty to me that they're not trained to do so for the most part and can actually make things worse. I've had parents go to a doctor and say, well, my child hasn't eaten anything except for bean burritos and chicken nuggets for 5 years. And the doctor say, yeah, but his growth is fine. Don't worry about it. So, or conversely, going to the doctor and saying, oh, no child will starve themselves. And that's admittedly rare, but just false. So about a third of parents will ask for help. And then we see from research that about half of children in the early childhood years are described as picky or fussy by parents. And that's not just the US. I think there's often this saying, well, that's Americans, spoiled Americans with their pathetic diet, and it's just the US. No, actually, we see, Dutch studies show similar numbers that about half of children. And then out of that, I read it as about 10% of children will struggle to the point where it impacts, like I said, kind of that extreme picky or persistent picky eating model.
Yeah.
So they're very, very common.
Okay. And I guess one thing that could be useful to go through, and I know you do this in your book, is like, what does typical eating for a child look like? Because I think we don't really, or most people don't really know what this should look like to gauge, is there really an issue here?
Absolutely. And again, here's this theme of misperceptions. So misperceptions around growth are a major reason why families get stuck with these counterproductive practices, these worries, my child's too big or too small, and then misperceptions around how kids eat or how much they eat, which is my kid's eating too much or not enough of the right food. So I'm glad you're bringing this up, because here's another scenario where I can often reassure parents. So the first year children are putting on a lot of weight and growing. They gain, I think on average, was it 7 kilograms, and in the second year it's about half that. So their growth really slows down the second year of life. I call that second year sort of the perfect storm. And so we have this impression as adults often that, the older they get, they should be eating a little bit more all of the time. And in fact, once children are weaned primarily off breast or bottle as their nutrition source, and more is on solids and table foods and family foods, that second and third year, it looks really erratic. It's really unpredictable. It's a lot one meal. It's one blueberry at the next meal. And our, in the US, we have the My Plate guide where parents sort of think, they should really be eating half of this meal should be fruits and vegetables, and a quarter should be a lean protein, and a quarter should be a high grain, high fiber starch. Children don't eat that way. And we set parents up for failure and for battles. And so what I do is you can't see me, but if you take your finger and your pointer finger and you just make a line kind of up and down, up and down, up and down, that's typical eating for young children. They'll have a lot one meal. They tend to eat also from one or two food groups. So a parent might put out 3 or 4 things, but one meal will be eating 2 clementines, and the next meal will be half a chicken nugget. And then the snack is whatever, it's a plain buttered pasta. And then the next is an entire apple, or, one bite of a cracker. And then they're running off to play. And parents feel this anxiety of, that can't be enough. It can't be enough to run around and play to just have one blueberry. So I need to try to get them to eat at least one bite of protein or chicken. And so we try to make kids eat more, especially if they're lower weight, or if they're bigger, those bigger meals scare us. And so we try to get them to eat less. We try to get them to eat like that My Plate, or like here's the finger in, the pointer finger, now draw a straight line, across the horizon. That's sort of how we want them to eat, or how our health agencies often talk about it. And I think the more that we try to get kids to eat to our expectations, the more it backfires. And research and experience tells us that. So absolutely expecting children to pick and choose, to me, that's where picky comes from. They pick and choose one food group, small amount here, larger amounts there. But at the end of a day or 2 or 3 days, typical eaters tend to eat from all the food groups.
Yeah.
And, I have a book called Love Me, Feed Me, and I just filled it with these examples from parents, because that's who other parents want to hear from, of, hey, my child only ate Greek yogurt for breakfast, and then half a cup of hummus, and then a piece of pizza, and this fruit here. And at the end of a couple days, it evened out. And so that's another area where I think we can reassure parents, and particularly around, I'm going to keep talking because I thought about protein.
Yeah.
If that's all right, Chris.
That's cool.
Protein and vegetables are the 2 big worries. And I just want to reassure parents that children often get 2 to 3 times the recommended amount of protein. So if you're worried about protein, or anything for that matter, if you're worried about something and that's causing you to, at that meal, say, well, you have to have a bite of chicken, or you have to have some nut butter, and you're getting into battles over it, find out if you actually need to worry. And oftentimes, particularly with things like protein, when I tell a parent, hey, they're getting actually 3 times as much protein, what do you think about not worrying about, pushing the protein smoothie at breakfast? once parents have those anxieties addressed, listened to, reassured, and they can let go of that worry, that's just a huge piece of that responsive model.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting, when I was reading your book, I was reflecting upon both myself as a child and also my son who's 5. And I feel very grateful that I'd found Ellyn Satter's work before having a child, and me and my wife are both on the same page. And so we were very up for the division of responsibility. And it's really interesting, the first year and a half of his life, he ate everything. We did baby-led weaning, and he was just kind of gung-ho for eating pretty much everything that we put in front of him. And then after about 18 months, maybe 2 years, he's become much more of what could be labeled as a picky eater. But we just watch him and know that, as you say, one meal it is just rice, or the next meal it is just the chicken, or the next meal it is just fruit. But if you tally it up across a week, he is definitely getting what he needs, and he has a very happy relationship with food. And what's interesting, and we can kind of get onto this more as we go through it, is when he is anxious, or when there is more stress, or when there is more things going on which actually don't relate to food, because we're not having those battles around food, that then affects his eating. And it's not that we're putting pressure on or anything, but just the ambient or background effects on his nervous system then have an impact on his eating. And it's been really interesting just to notice how that is. And it feels like more recently, over the last couple of months, he's coming out of his shell a lot more. He's coming out of being more picky. He's trying more things without us having to pressure or do anything along those lines, just as he has started to develop more and go through a better phase.
No, absolutely. And I love that story. And we had, the same thing. And I think that there's also such a relief, right? I mean, when you probably, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you probably socialize, maybe less so with COVID, but, socializing with friends with young children who don't do it this way. Yeah. And then there's so much emotional energy and attention and conflict and stress, and particularly around food. And it's amazing. I mean, I see again, and I was there, I was doing it. So I come to parents with such an empathetic, I guess, rather than empathic, empathetic, with empathy. Yeah. And just that it feels really counterintuitive in our culture, where we feel like we have to control and educate and narrate and, talk about nutrition and sort of mold their palates and control it. And, letting go of that control and that worry was such a relief. And when I have parents who say, "Oh, this feels so good, I don't have to be the food cop anymore," flipping to that, particularly that flip side of, food preoccupied kids that I work with, when parents can tap into and lean into that relief and the relationship with the child. And I mean, it's just so liberating somehow, this model. And then when we accept children for what they're eating now, it's a bit of that sort of motivational interviewing, or some of this idea of sort of radical acceptance, all of this. Yeah. When we accept how kids eat now, it opens the space for their own curiosity and hunger. And, that's why we eat, really, as humans. We eat because something looks good or smells good or tastes good, primarily or first. And so when it's not adults trying to manage and curate how they want their kids to turn out with food, which usually backfires with a lot of love and effort, it can make space for those discoveries for kids. And I remember the same thing. My daughter, we put, dozens and dozens and dozens of salads in front of her for years. And she would eat sort of the cucumbers off the top or a few things, but didn't touch lettuce. And this is another message I want to share with parents, is waiting for this process can feel very frustrating. And there are a lot of parents who want to sort of jump in and make it happen faster. But she then, at age probably 6, just without any comment from me or her, put some lettuce on her plate, ate it, and said, "Oh, I love lettuce." And 6 years of me not saying anything is pretty difficult in our culture, where we want to sort of say, "Well, look at the lettuce, and it's green like the leaf on the tree. And look, I'm going to paint ketchup with this piece of lettuce, and we're going to do art, and we're going to touch it, and we're going to, even if we're not pressuring or coercing, the attention, the talking about it, the nutrition, the art, the playing with it, for many kids, that slows down their internal process and can result in resistance. So it's kind of it's something to train towards, that art of not saying anything when you're like, "I know you're going to like this if you would just try it." So it's really a fascinating process.
Yeah, it will, as you've kind of said in the book as well, like kids are smart. They can understand when you're pressuring them, even if you're doing it very subtly or you're trying to do it in a playful way. And so, yeah, I like let's plate everything up and we'll put everything in on the table, and then you get to decide what you want to do with this. And not putting the pressure on. And I think for me as well, I can reflect on myself as a kid, and I wasn't that interested in food. Like it wasn't like, I didn't feel like I was picky. Food just didn't appeal to me that much. There are other things I wanted to be doing with my time. I remember having quite an aversion to certain tastes and textures. I didn't like anything fatty because of how it would taste. And I outgrew all of those things. And I really love food and can eat basically anything. But I also think that that's in part down to my parents, my mum in particular. I can't ever remember her trying to pressure me to have certain foods or like just have this thing. Like I outgrew it at the point that I outgrew it, which was probably not until I was in my very late teens or even like early 20s.
Oh, it's so fascinating. And I think it also speaks to, I'm imagining that your basic nutritional needs were met. And, this is that piece of how's the child doing otherwise, if you'd been suffering malnutrition, she may have intervened, but I feel like,
I wasn't suffering malnutrition, but right. I was small. Like there are pictures of me in my school photo where it looks like I'm standing in the wrong year because I was small. But I had been small from the day I was born, right. And that was just how I was. So I don't know about growth charts and if they were looking at that, but I imagine I kept to the same percentile the whole way through.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what I feel like we're in this weird situation, particularly in the US, where I see so many children getting therapy that I don't think needed it. And there are many children and infants who need help who aren't accessing it. So You sound like so many of my clients that I see who've come to me after they've failed desensitization therapy for a year and a half, and now they're crying at the table because they've had to be expected to kiss or lick or poke a food. And so I see so many children like you with some sensory differences or preferences, where maybe kids who don't like the feel of meat, or they don't want to have mixed textures, or they have these preferences. This is also a bit of this neurodiversity affirming piece. If we have a child who's smaller than average, but doing well, they're not distressed, they're meeting their nutritional needs, and they just say they don't like the feel of meat, or they don't like mixed textures, or, can we just let that be and accept that humans come in a range of shapes and sizes, and some will be smaller than average and some bigger than average, and people have their preferences. And so much I see a rush to therapy around kids just like you. And then I see them after when they're 5 and 6 and they've failed sensory therapies, and now they're eating less, and now they're crying at the table because, they had to do these therapy snacks that they didn't enjoy. And so one thing I guess I'm sharing from this is, if we can look at small, healthy smaller than average but healthy, maybe has some different preferences, but they're covering their nutritional needs and they're doing well. Do we need to rush in with pressuring, bribing, rewarding, or therapies that sometimes pressure, bribe, and reward versus letting it unfold? Anyway, it was just fascinating that your story, that having the space that you were able to find that for yourself and grow into your own relationship with food. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And it is I know again from chatting with friends and relatives, like friends of the family and relatives, and they were like, oh, always concerned about me or concerned that I was never eating, but I never felt that in my family home. I never felt pressure, and just how much of a godsend that was, because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know how much I really dodged a bullet there, because it could have very easily gone a different way.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I could have seen you now being labeled low appetite sensory subtype of avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, where the diagnosis is saying not growing to expected or growth faltering. And I see sometimes, kids labeled when they're really meeting their nutritional needs and they're doing okay. So, and again, because I'm a doctor in the U.S., have to do all my disclaimers of there certainly are children who are struggling, or teens and adults who need help with this. But I do question that we are potentially over labeling and over therapizing situations that may just be variants of typical, or what we might see eating with sensory differences.
Yeah. And so I think it would be useful to talk about the mechanics of learning to eat, because this was something I hadn't really thought about until reading the book. And just, I'm at a stage now where I eat where I don't have to think about eating. I don't have to think about what my tongue or my teeth are doing. So yeah, just talk about how that develops and how things can go awry.
Sure. So this, I just want to be clear, it's not my area of expertise. I can speak to it in a broad sense, but that's why I wrote it with an SLP, and why our responsive feeding professionals group has speech therapists, occupational therapists, psychologists, is that we all have these areas of expertise. And so, yeah, learning to eat involves so many things, and it's pretty complicated. And for the vast majority, it goes off pretty smoothly. So, there are 27 muscles involved coordinated in swallowing. There are, you have to be able to hold your body up. So you've got the gross motor, the fine motor of trying to pick up foods and get them in your mouth. And then hopefully everything's working well with your mouth. I know that we are seeing, with tongue ties and issues like that, where the tongue is tied either in the front, or you might have a tongue tie in the back. And so, how are things functionally? How are things working? So if you have a newborn who is really struggling with breastfeeding or bottle feeding and isn't gaining weight, then they need to have an evaluation with somebody who's really trained in looking at the function and how the tongue and the swallow is going. So, and it may not be just, the person assigned to you at the hospital. You might have to find more support. So we do see tongue ties and tethered tissue. I'm also wondering if we're now overdiagnosing that as well. So this is, it's always really complicated. Finding professionals who will look at the big picture and function and the relationship is really important. So just to say that there's a lot that goes into it. And then the sensory oral, the oral motor piece is, can they feel what's happening inside their mouths? Can they feel when they're swallowing a food? So a child who's learning to eat solids, who is constantly gagging or choking, that could be a sign of a sensory motor problem. Or it could be that, for example, baby-led weaning, which you mentioned is really popular. And I do think that's a difficult thing to prepare those foods in safe ways, potentially. So if someone's doing baby-led weaning, I always recommend, the specific cookbooks and really following what they say. Because, for example, my daughter, I would give her a teething biscuit, and anything she would chomp off. She was a huge chomper, and then would have the giant chunk and would, promptly gag impressively. And so she was there before baby-led weaning really took off. And we just did a combination of mashing foods and spoon feeding and her self-feeding herself. So anyway, that's a bit of a digression. And then in terms of learning to eat, it's also misperceptions there. So if I have a parent of an 18-month-old say, well, I'm really worried about protein and he's not eating meat, which I hear a fair amount. Well, the molars to really grind and do that rotary chew pattern don't usually come in till about age 2 to 3. So again, it's about age 3 before they have the adult chewing pattern where they're really able to grind and manipulate food and swallow it the way an adult would. So it's a process, and there are some, red flags, like I mentioned, of really frequent gagging or choking. If they've had aspiration pneumonia, usually you'll know if something like that's happening. If, I've had calls from parents of like a 2.5-year-old saying, well, they're only having purees from the pouches or yogurt or very, meltable, mashable foods. And then I'll dig a bit deeper and then no, they never mouthed objects as infants. Oh, that's right. I didn't have to baby proof with this one. And oh yeah. And my older child was managing many more complicated foods by this age. So that's someone I would refer to a qualified speech pathologist or pediatric dentist, just to make sure that we're not missing something functional in that situation.
Yeah. And then there's also like the feeding temperament piece, which I thought, again, very much then reflected upon myself and my wife and my son when reading it, because I think this is useful to know. And I think if the child's temperament matches up to the parents, then maybe it's going to be okay. But if there's a difference there, that could then be seen as a problem.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I have lots of parents who are foodies and love food and had, in mind, like we all as parents do, sort of fantasize about having sushi with their 6-year-old. And then you have social media where you have a parent saying, oh, look, here's Amelia having her green smoothie, and it's from a mason jar, and the comment is Mama did something right. And which I actually unfollowed an acquaintance for over that, because the not so subtle message is if your kid's not eating green smoothies, Mama did something wrong, and that's just not the case. We come with different temperaments and different approaches to life in general, and that includes food. And there was a fun study about 5 years ago where they put toddlers in front of a new food and later in front of new toys. And they found that, that there were kids who just jumped in with both and immediately explored them, and other kids, and one is not better or worse than the other, just the other child held back and didn't jump into those new experiences. And so that temperament is really important. And also, if you have a child who really wants to do things their way, their time, very independent, some parents call it stubborn, that if you ask that child, well, I just want you to take a no thank you bite and then you can have more mashed potatoes. The easygoing child who jumps in will, okay, I'll take that bite of kohlrabi, I'll try it. And they might even say, yeah, that's not bad. But then the child who's very independent and, would rather fight for half an hour struggling to put a shoe on than have a parent help them, when you ask them to do a no thank you bite or a tiny taste, it's a 45-minute, meltdown or tantrum. Yeah. And so that is often a piece that's really, again, reassuring to parents, is just that, this is how they are, and it's okay to be cautious. And Ellyn Satter says slow to warm up. It's okay to take your time with learning to like a new food. It might be 6 years before they try the lettuce, and that's all right if they're meeting their basic nutritional needs. Is that temperament may explain, if a parent says, well, we use the no thank you bite and it works great. And then the other parent says, well, it works for 2 of our kids, but for the third, it's not. So that temperament piece is part of that as well.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, when I reflect on my son, like his eating matches up with his temperament. And so it kind of just reading your book, I was like, okay, this makes sense really clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And same with my daughter. So she went off milk for about a year. So I, for some months, I sort of said, okay, that's fine. And she wouldn't drink it. So I was cooking with, evaporated milk or trying to find different foods with calcium just to support it in other ways. And then finally, at one point, I reached out to a colleague and she suggested, well, try just putting glasses of milk out for everyone at lunch and saying, well, we're all having milk today. So I tried it and she just immediately, what do you mean we're having milk today? I want water. Why do I have to drink milk? And it was this immediate battle. And so I thought, okay, well, we tried that. And that was a useful piece of information. So I completely backed off again. So of course, go get yourself some water. And then maybe 6 months later, she started drinking milk again. And has been off and on milk for years. And so again, it's a big part of this process of feeding kids is what can we control? What do we think we can control that we might be making things worse? And then if we realize we can't really control their weight or how much they eat, we can put that energy into, and it's a lot of effort. Okay, I'm going to get food in front of my child 5 times a day. And I'm going to try to have pleasant meal times where we can eat together if that works and for your family. And so it's shifting the energy and the focus from things we can't control to things that we can. And I really think that when we set up the environment to be one where a child feels comfortable and safe and welcome, and the discussion at the table might be about their art project or what the cat did before mealtime, rather than, you haven't tried a bite of kohlrabi yet, and I really just need you to take one bite. And where the focus is on what or how much the child is or isn't eating, it just opens this world of possibility in terms of supporting the child's relationship with food and really with their bodies as well.
Yeah. And so let's kind of go through that in more detail. And I know in the book you talk about STEPS plus as sort of the acronym for the steps as part of doing it. So let's start with step 1, which is decrease stress, anxiety, and power struggles. So do you want to just talk about this, and then I can ask
Sure.
any specific questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, if you dread meal times, then you have opportunities to decrease that stress and anxiety. And so when kids and adults, when we're anxious, it's like the saying, if you have butterflies in your stomach, then there's no room for the food. So you mentioned with your son, when he's agitated, even if it's not about the food, you notice that impacts his appetite.
Yeah.
So we want to set up a meal time where the child can come and feel that felt safety, where their bodies and their minds are as calm as possible. And this will look different for different families, by the way. If you have a child who has sensory differences or needs to stand or needs a weighted blanket or even a fidget at the table, each child will have a slightly different thing to make that mealtime a safe and pleasant experience for them. So the main thing I think that decreases autonomy or anxiety rather is supporting the child's autonomy, is they get to decide once they come to the table, how much and what are they going to eat from what you provided. And you're not battling over extra bites. You're not trying to get them to eat more or less. And it's really the child's autonomy and their choice. So they have a sense of control over what goes into their bodies.
Yeah.
So that's probably the first thing. This is just a little random thing, but, sometimes parents say, well, what do I talk about if all we've been talking about is, nagging him to eat more? Just anything. What happened at soccer? Who did you sit next to? Letting the child lead. There are little games where you can have conversation starters. I try to shy away from actually the game of, or the idea of, what's your best and worst thing? Because sometimes kids can get stuck in the worst thing and then that appetite decreases. So
Yeah.
that's that responsive piece. One child may like to unburden themselves and they feel better and they eat more, whereas another child gets really stuck in, the fight they had with their friend at recess. So this is that piece of trusting parents to set up that environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I liked the piece with this is like, what are you anxious about, and what is your child anxious about? Like asking it from both sides, because I think both of those matter. Like if a parent is anxious about the fact that I need the child, or I want the child to eat more of this thing, or I worry that they're not getting enough protein or enough vegetables, that's going to have an impact. But equally, if the child is worried that they're going to be forced to eat something that they don't want to eat, that they're going to be having this uncomfortable meal time, then that's going to have an impact as well. So I like the fact that it was kind of looking at this from both sides.
Absolutely. It's a relationship. There are 2 or 3 or 4 people in the relationship, depending on the mealtime. And this is that bit about, you mentioned it briefly, family style or buffet style serving.
Yeah.
So that's a big piece of, probably one of the number one pieces of advice, along with serving dessert or something sweet with the meal. We can talk about that next. But number one practical advice for decreasing the power struggles and supporting autonomy is to let children serve themselves at meal times. And yes, they will only serve themselves their preferred food for a while. They'll put mashed potatoes on, and then maybe they'll have seconds of mashed potatoes before they've touched that kohlrabi. And that's where having the faith in this process helps to not say, well, you have to eat a piece of kohlrabi before you can have more mashed potatoes. Because it doesn't work. I think that's the piece too, is when you find yourself as a parent saying, well, I can't let them have seconds on mashed potatoes before they have kohlrabi, pausing and thinking, well, why am I going to do or say what I'm about to do or say? Yeah. Well, it's because I want them to eat the kohlrabi. And then, well, how has it worked for me so far, this method? Okay, it's not working. So I have to sort of have faith in waiting and really. What we see from research and from the clients I've worked with is, with a bit of time, children will branch out, and pretty universally, even kids with sensory issues or who are neurodivergent will often branch out when the pressure is off. So serving family style, and let's say though it's soup and they need help, or it's lentils and your child is 18 months old or 2, you can ask them, the goal is to preserve autonomy. So I might hold up the whatever it is and say, is this okay? And they say more or less. Okay, this much, yes. Point to your plate where you want it. And so then they can point where it is so that they're not immediately saying, that's too much. That's touching that. I don't want that. So you might even get those plates that have the little compartments. So if you have a child that is upset when foods touch each other, use a plate with compartments for a time, or, always. It's so it's figuring out, this is where following your child's anxiety, the conflict, points to opportunities to make changes. So definitely self-serving really helps. And let's say you have a food preoccupied child that you're doing this model with, and let's say there are 6 corn muffins, and immediately the kids are realizing that there's not enough for everyone to have 2, so they're pouncing on them. You might serve that for a child. So there's ways to modify this where, okay, there's only this many corn muffins, so I'm giving everyone 1 on the side of their plate. So all of this is flexible based on preserving that calm mealtime for that child and for that family, if at all possible.
Yeah. And I know, like, for us, like, sometimes it is putting everything on the table and it's serve yourself and it's tapas style. But often I will plate up for my son, but he knows he doesn't need to eat any of those things. He can eat some of those things. If he wants more of anything, he can ask. But for him, having it already plated up doesn't really matter, because he knows there's not going to be any pushing of he has to eat those things.
Absolutely. And so that's where you find what works for you. And we also pre-plate often, or I'll serve the green beans because it's closer to me. Now, once my daughter got older, I didn't want to be doing all the dishes. So we just have hot pads on the table and the pots come right on the table once that was safe to do. And so we serve each other sometimes. And I think some of this stuff is a bit transitional. So you might, especially if you have a really, really anxious or food preoccupied child, you might be sort of really sticking with this structure in place and this scaffolding, and then seeing where you can build in more flexibility with it, as you've done with your son. And, at one point, I have to admit too, I wasn't following I don't follow all of these quote rules. My daughter would, maybe she was 4 or 5. And I tried this for a while where she was sort of choosy and would say, oh, I don't want that. And I'd say, okay. And I'd say, well, can I put a little bit on your plate? You don't have to eat it. And she said, fine. And maybe half the time she would taste it and eat more, but it didn't upset her. And so I did it. But like with the milk, that was very clearly, ooh, this is different. And so, I think there's leeway for parents. I know I talked to another dietitian and she said, I have 3 kids and one of them would never take something. And so I will often, with his permission, put something on his plate. And then half the time he eats it and there's no upset. Yeah. He's not upset. He knows he doesn't have to eat it. It's almost like just a motor planning or an initiation thing. And that's responsive. That's what I love about this responsive piece is you can have 3 kids and realize that for one of them, maybe putting something on their plate is what's actually supportive for that child. Whereas the one next to them, they would fling the plate across the table and then not eat for 2 hours. So there is flexibility in all of this to a degree.
It's meant to give you a bit of a guide, and then you understand your child and their temperament and what works through trial and error, and then you make it look the way that it works best for you.
Yeah. But I want to say the one piece where I feel like we really, really, really need to not think that there's flexibility and where almost always we preserve that the child is the one who decides what and how much goes in their mouth. Yeah. So there might be flexibility on pre-plating or sweets with a meal, or, even might ask them to try something. There might be flexibility around the routine and offering food for some children between meals and snacks. But the part where I stand very firm in almost every situation is the child decides when they're done or when they're done eating or starting. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess the one caveat I would have for that is in eating disorder recovery, where someone's doing FBT and it's part of that child has to finish what's being offered. So I think that would be sort of the exception. Absolutely. But I agree with you in every other case. Yes, it is down to them to decide.
Yes, no, for sure. When there's weight recovery and malnutrition, that's a different story. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. And I would also say, like, your comment about like kids not wanting to try something, like I always think of trips where I've been in, I don't know, Thailand or somewhere, and you go into a market and in the market they have crickets that have been roasted, or they'll have foods that I have never even considered eating. And I try to think of that's often what it's like for a child. And so even though we are very used to eating prawns, or we're very used to eating olives, or whatever it may be, for a child, it is the equivalent of walking into some market where they are facing completely new foods that feel very strange to them.
Absolutely. And sometimes I have, when I do workshops, I do sort of an empathy exercise. And, so I would ask you and your listeners to just think for a minute, has there ever been a food that you had a really bad experience with, whether it was, food poisoning or you vomited or like a really aversive experience? And I'm curious, Chris, if you've had a bad experience with something.
The first thing that comes to mind is whiskey. So not a food, but I remember getting sick on whiskey as a teenager and not being able to drink it for probably 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to give a food example, for me, it was freshman year of college, salsa. I threw up salsa and I didn't eat it for probably 5 years. Yeah. And so, for those of you listening, if you think of a food like that where you've had a bad experience, and what's happening in your body as you think about that food. And, maybe your forehead is crinkling up and and you feel that a bit of disgust and even a memory of nausea. And then, that's part of why I talk about when we pre-plate. So imagine, Chris, every meal you sat down to, there was a little teaspoon of whiskey sitting next to your plate. Or for me, like there's a bowl of salsa, and every meal you come and there it is on your plate, and you have to, maybe you don't have to do anything with it, but maybe that someone will say, well, you have to dip something in it or lick it or take one bite before you can have mashed potatoes. And so I think often putting those empathy exercises in of, oh, okay, so when I ask them to, eat this thing, it could be a really similar aversive experience. So when I'm, what reward would have enticed you to have a shot of whiskey in those 15 years, And thinking about for children, when they come to a meal where they don't feel good around a food, their body is in an anxious state often, and now they can't even tell that they're hungry. The hunger cues are gone. The curiosity around new food's gone. They're not having a good time. And this is often when parents say, well, I get so annoyed. They say they're not hungry at the meal. I dismiss them. Then as soon as I've cleaned the kitchen, they come back, and now they are looking for that granola bar or the chips or the crisps or whatever it is. And when I talk to them and say, well, what happened was at mealtime, they were so upset because of the pre-plated food and they couldn't have what they wanted, and they were already whining and negotiating. So the hunger, they can't actually tune into it. Yeah. And then they've left the table, they've gone to their Legos or their book or their iPad, and then their body calms down again, and there are those hunger cues. And so they're going to now look for food. So it's not being manipulative or naughty. It's just that they really, at a mealtime that was all about negotiating and attention on their eating and trying to figure out how to please the adults, or maybe they're old enough that they're no longer interested in pleasing adults and they just want to kind of, get under their skin. So it's not, it's a lot going on, particularly with young kids, though. It's not naughty or willful. It's just that they couldn't tune into hunger in that setting. Yeah. And we want kids to eat or not eat based on what's going on inside of their bodies, not to either please or tick off the adults in their lives. So, that's tuned in eating, is eating for reasons of hunger, curiosity, connection, fuel, rather than I'm eating to earn a reward or a sticker, or I have to stop eating because I'm getting a withering glance from, my auntie or whatever it is. So we want to support that internally driven eating. Yeah, definitely. And so then step 2 is establish a routine. Yes. Yeah. So very often when children are felt to not be eating enough, they get the advice of just try to get food into them whenever you can. So I've had adults sort of chasing kids around with a bite of sausage or a Tupperware container, or, a liquid supplement like a Pediasure type of thing. And that doesn't really support appetite. Then they're not eating generally to fullness. And so pretty much universally with children, child feeding folks, the routine helps to support appetite cues. It gives them the opportunity to get a little bit hungry, but not ravenous between eating opportunities. And so that usually looks like eating every 2 to 3 hours for younger children, and maybe every 2.5 to 4 hours for older children. And so that tends to support appetite for children where there may be challenges in terms of interoception, that ability to tune in for whatever reason. Maybe they had food insecurity, or there was a lot of pressure, or they've been restricted. So that structure allows some of those external supports to offer food at a pretty regular interval. So, and it just helps, particularly with food preoccupation, when kids know they're going to be fed versus the impulse of, oh, he's playing at the park and he's distracted from his food, and I'm worried he's too big, so I'm going to try to stretch this out. that impulse often then leads to them looking up and realizing, oh, I haven't been fed. I can't count on this. And now they're sort of more frantic or more anxious. So that reassurance of, hey, we're at the park, and calling the kids over and saying, oh, let's sit for a minute and have a snack, and then you can go on to play. It's that reassurance of knowing, particularly where there's been food insecurity or restriction around food, I'm going to be fed so I can let go of that anxiety. And I saw that in my own daughter as a toddler, and I see it in clients as well.
Yeah, definitely. And also there where the child can say, I'm perfectly happy playing. I'm not really hungry right now. And that's also okay. Mm-hmm. And they continue
Absolutely.
on doing what they're doing.
Absolutely. It's offering the opportunity. And then you might decide as the adult, oh, they were at the park playing, and so they're quite hungry. So I might offer an extra little snack before dinner, or we'll move dinner up half an hour if we can. So we are sort of managing that structure in ways that are supportive.
Yeah, it's not that every day you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the exact same time. It's like going with the ebbs and flows of life, of like, oh, we were a bit busier, and so this happened a little later, or we had this thing a little earlier just to make this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I do think, though, for when I am working with food preoccupied clients, or where there's been food insecurity, that's again that transition where in the beginning it will be clockwork and okay. If at all possible, of just sort of offering every 2 to 3 hours. And with the foster kids that I work with, it might even be every hour and a half for the first few days, of just, you will get fed, and allowing that to sink into that sense of safety. So again, in some situations, they might really need a bit more of that more firm structure and more of that effort, but that generally is transitional as well, in terms of then being able, once they've experienced that in their bodies and trusted that I don't need to worry that I'll get fed, then they often can have a bit more flexibility into that.
Yeah, definitely. And then one of the things that you mentioned in the book that I didn't know was a thing, but was something we do here, was like the rescue snack, which is like the snack in the evening around bedtime or just before bedtime. Like Ramsey, he much prefers snacks to meals. And so dinner, he often doesn't have that much, but then in the evening, often in bed while doing a book, he will have a couple of pieces of fruit, because that's what he then wants as a snack, and that's like the snack that we offer in the evening. And he often will eat more in bed as part of that snack while doing books than he did at his dinner. But that's kind of how he rolls and what he likes.
And if that works for you, then that works for you. And there's so many, this timing piece also around dinner. That's a story I hear quite often of, they won't eat dinner. And so one of the beauty of the scaffolding of the structure is that we don't get to decide when they're most hungry. And so often kids are really, really hungry right after school. And so as frustrating as it is, planning on a filling snack, it might be an entire sandwich and, some baby carrots or whatever it is, leftover, whatever. But that what I often see parents trying to do is, there's so much attention on the healthy food. And here's the worry of, well, I'm going to have the veg with dinner. And so child comes home at 4:30, everyone's frantic trying to get dinner on the table at 5:30 and, make the most of that hunger. And meanwhile, the kid's pestering for food and everyone's upset. Some people call that the witching hour. And playing around with that schedule of just saying, look, he's hungry. Let's get him something. And maybe you as well. I often have something in the mid-afternoon. Let's sit down when he gets home and maybe, decompresses by talking at you or with an iPad for a few minutes, have a snack that's substantial, and then move dinner back till 6:30 or 7. And so playing around with that schedule in ways that work for you, and trying not to sort of have this frantic rush to get dinner on has been such a relief for so many families I've worked with, where for some reason it's sort of, I'll give them 3 pretzels at 4:30 and then they're whining and begging. And so then I'll chuck a few more pretzels at them to keep them quiet. And then dinner comes around and they're not hungry. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so then step 3 is enjoy pleasant family meals. So maybe just to start with, like, what is a family meal? How would you define this?
Yeah, so a family meal, we can also just call it eating together or connected meal times, because I think sometimes family meal takes on this like, oh, I can't do it. I can't cook the roasted chicken and the mashed potatoes. I feel like it has to be from scratch, and everyone has to be there. And really just one connected, attuned, responsive adult eating with the child is a family meal. And so letting go of some of that, has to be everyone at the table. It doesn't, with split shifts or other things going on, or a single parent, one adult eating with a child who's engaged and has a warm regard for the child and is offering that connection. That's a family meal. And it can be home cooked. It can be takeout. It can be convenience. It can be at McDonald's. It can be parked in the parking lot of a restaurant where you're sitting, or I used to pick my daughter up from her daycare / preschool. And even though they had a snack right before the end of the day, it was always like a pretzel stick and a Dixie cup of water. So she was ravenous. So I would pick her up, and it was about half an hour, 20 minutes to home. And we would just sit in the parking lot, and she'd sit up front and play with the radio, and I'd have a snack. And that's a family meal. That's a connected mealtime that's supportive. And so letting go of some of those shoulds and images, and also recognizing that a lot of adults did not grow up with pleasant family meals, that sometimes meal times were super stressful, a little content warning, but, food trauma around meal times. If you had a parent who was unpredictable or chaotic, or, if you ever got smacked at the table or had to eat something, and bad things have happened to people at family meals. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that way. A family meal, if that's really daunting or stressful or triggering for you, maybe the first family meal or eating together is like I described, eating together in the car at the parking lot, or it's on a blanket outside, and building these positive connected experiences that are safe and also satisfying for the adult as well.
Yeah. And I think the sentence that I highlighted from this that I really love is, you are the most important thing at the table, not the vegetables. And I think this kind of just sums up this whole approach of like how important it is to be connected and really establishing that happy environment, or happy might not be the right word, but the right kind of environment around food.
Absolutely. And even our modern kitchens work against us, where a lot of people are eating at the kitchen island. And, when I've done home visits and here's mom or dad, basically like a short order chef of sort of, here's the first course, and this is coming out of the oven, and the kids are lined up on the bar stools. And so, that certainly can happen at meal times, but and there's nothing wrong with it, within this context. But I think that if we can sit down with children, so, having them help set the table and then sitting down with them to eat, and they also then get the message that we are worthy of being nourished as well, and eating together. And when the meal times, the connected meal times are that safe place, it's really a reliable touchstone. As my daughter's gotten older and now she has more homework, mealtime is the place every day we connect, at breakfast and dinner most nights. And I'm going to segue into another bit here. And maybe for you, this is something you haven't really faced yet, but particularly in the US, the extracurricular activities and the team sports come fast and furious, or art class or theater or whatever it is. And it's something, if you have young children, to talk about your values. And because of our start and my work, for us, prioritizing family meals was a main value for our family. And I think it's as important as learning an instrument or being on a travel team, if not more important, to help kids get this foundation. So that was our family value. And so when our daughter was doing synchronized swimming as a second grader, which is super cute, as cute and hysterical as it sounds. 1 year was great because it was one Wednesday and one Saturday, but that was 9 months where we gave up every Saturday morning and a Wednesday. By 2 years later, it was 3 nights a week, and we opted out, even though she was really good at it and apparently had the right toes or whatever. So that's hard to say no to opportunities. And the same happened with the swim team in 7th grade. And just this last year, volleyball in high school. I'm going to rant a bit about sports. I don't know where you're located, but youth sports in the U.S., 4 to 7 p.m., 5 days a week is volleyball, or whatever the sport is for our town. And then 2 days a week, they're traveling for games where they're on buses for 4 to 6 hours each day. And so, and she loved it, and she was good, and she's tall, and we just said no. And we, when she started last year, we said, we're going to see how this goes. If you're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're anxious, it's interfering with your social life or studying, we're going to pull you out because that's our job. And I think having those discussions before those opportunities come up is helpful and is important. And she's had to sacrifice some of those opportunities, but that's, and I think we're all okay with it, but having those discussions in advance is important.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, you need to work out what are your values and what do you think are most important or more important, and then making decisions based on that. At this stage, I haven't had to make any decisions along those lines.
Yeah. And, and if the team sport is the value, then figuring out, okay, well, we'll pick you up at 7 and we're going to eat right after and you join us, or, making sure they're getting fed. Because I know you do eating disorder work, and I see this so often. These kids, they're having lunch at noon, and then they have half an hour, and then they're going until 7:30, or they were eating their dinners from vending machines. And so I think it's something that is kind of this, yes, youth sports are great for kids, but there's also that side of really having to look at each child and be thoughtful about, is it great for this kid? Is this sport great for this kid and this family? So it's complicated.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just, is this sport ready? It's like, right, it's, is this amount of this sport right? And how it fits in. And so, I'm glad you went off on that tangent and mentioned it, because I think it's definitely an important thing. And for so many of my clients as well, like their issues started when they got into the cross-country team, or it started when they got a scholarship to go and play hockey. And so, I think it's helpful that you've mentioned it.
Yeah. And you know what, honestly, I've given this advice too. If I have if you've got a 7-year-old who's low appetite, struggling with eating, low weight, maybe ballet isn't, maybe not signing up for these really not identity heavy, the looks or the individual sports. So that might be a child where, well, you know what, let's look at soccer, or let's look at something else. So, or maybe the wrestling isn't the right, maybe we just have to pull them. And even if they love it, these are really hard decisions. There were tears were shed over volleyball, and yet we all know and agree it was the right decision. So hard stuff. And like everything in the US, it feels like, or maybe this is everywhere, it feels like it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
With food, it's all or nothing. With volleyball, literally it's, 30 plus hours a week, or it's nothing. And that's, that is a lot of cultural shifting that hopefully will happen someday.
Yeah. Okay. So then step 4 is build skills in what and how to feed.
Right. So that is really to parents, and that's around considering, things like menu planning or shopping, or, having different meals for different days of the week. So if Wednesday is the soccer day, then Wednesday might be getting takeout on the way home. And so that's the not really sexy part of just planning on how to get food in front of us roughly every, 2 to 4 hours. And that can be very, very tricky for some. Some really enjoy cooking, others don't. And so, again, I think if we can address some of the nutrition worries that's helpful. Lots of kids like fruit, and fruit has a lot of the same nutrition benefits as vegetables. So sometimes it's as easy as saying, don't worry about the vegetables, have fruit, put fruit in your smoothie. So it's about sort of supporting the nutrition piece and thinking, in the book, we go into things like what flavors does your child like? So bridging to different foods to offer. If you have a child who likes crunchy things, you might think of serving crunchy things. If you're introducing, or, if they don't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, but they like crunch, you might do freeze-dried vegetables or fruits, or offering these different things. If they have a condiment that they like, I just did a reel on this on Instagram. If they like ketchup, put ketchup on the table at every meal, or even sprinkles. I was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but my 16-year-old doesn't eat a lot of breakfast food. So here's another thing, let them have the leftover stir fry for breakfast. Food is food. And so letting go of some of those shoulds. And so my daughter hadn't eaten a waffle in probably 5 years, and my husband and I had waffles, and she came down and surprised us and said, "Oh, can I have one?" And we sort of bit our tongue, and then she got up and got sprinkles out and ate half a waffle with her hands with, like a little quarter, like a piece of pizza with a little bit of sprinkles and syrup on it. And so things like sprinkles or syrup or crunchy, might be sesame seeds or panko crumb in the air fryer. So thinking about what does your child like or prefer now, and that can help in terms of what to offer. But so lots of different ideas on that one.
Yeah, there was lots of different suggestions there, and I think there was the comment as well as like not trying to hide foods, like how that can also backfire, because I think that's often the advice of, okay, just try and smuggle these things in, and what you suggested was adding them, but telling the child you're adding them, so that there is in a sense consent to them, to them knowing about this thing and then tasting it and being able to say, oh, I don't actually notice that much, or it doesn't put me off that food, or actually, no, I don't like it when that thing is in there.
Right. Absolutely. And a lot of times parents who are sneaking don't need to, because the children are meeting, more than their basic nutrition needs. And there's research out that picky eaters get their basic nutritional needs and tend to grow just as well as other children. Even with the extreme picky eaters, we see lower weight, but we also see extreme picky eaters who are normal and higher weight. So if you have the impulse to sneak, I would say dig deeper into your worry, and do you need to worry? Can you let it go? And then I would say, again, be very, very careful. I hear all the time from parents of kids who eat 10 foods who are very limited and say, I tried to put riced cauliflower in his scrambled eggs. And of course, these kids can sense a fleck of pepper. And she was heartbroken. She said, now the trust is broken, and now he won't even eat scrambled eggs, which was probably the most nutritious food the child ate. So be very, very careful. I just pretty much never recommend sneaking if at all possible. So,
Yeah, we sometimes breakfast will make a smoothie to go with breakfast, and kind of made a fun game of trying to guess what's in the smoothie. And so the smoothie will end up having like 15 things in it, even if I put like the tiniest bit of kale or mushroom or whatever it is that you can't even taste, and it's mostly like fruits. But that then made it an interesting way of like, okay, who can guess the most things while we drink this thing.
Oh, that's fun. And if he's engaged in that, awesome. Most kids who've been, and that probably works with your son because he hasn't been pressured along the way. This is often the kind of thing that feeding therapists will suggest to do. And for kids who've had pressure around their eating, and I believe that a lot of therapies pressure, they will not generally go for this. So just a heads up that if one of your listeners tries that and the kid's like, and upset or isn't really into it, I wouldn't worry about it. And I think a smoothie is another really great example of with nutrition where perfect can be the enemy of the good. And so, for example, I don't find the color of a green smoothie, personally, I don't find that appealing. And I think this is some of my own background of anytime I feel a should or that health, like, oh, I should have a green smoothie, I have that internal resistance to it. And so, and kids will have external resistance. But, I tried back in the day of adding flax oil to smoothies, and I could taste it, and I thought it didn't help the flavor of it particularly, and different things like that. And so I think that there's so much pressure to have the green smoothie, whereas our go-to smoothie, and again, my child doesn't drink a lot of milk unless it's with a sweet or a baked good, then she chooses milk. But so breakfasts, where more times than not she's eating the turkey curry from the night before, we'll have a smoothie, and it's milk, a little bit of heavy cream, frozen bananas, and frozen strawberries. I mean, it's kind of a milkshake.
Yeah.
Just, has maybe a bit less sugar than a standard milkshake, but we all really enjoy it. And we usually all have some. And for me too, I try to think with my sort of gentle nutrition of getting calcium, and it's a great source of protein and fat and carbohydrates and energy. And so for parents, like, rather than fight over 3 sips of green smoothie, then you open the door to these benefits of these delicious smoothies that do offer really good nutrition, but just not that sort of image of, quote, perfect nutrition. So, striving for perfect can really undermine pretty good nutrition in scenarios with kids as well.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I'm wanting to make it as enjoyable for me as well. And so I will taste it, and there'll be times like, that's not great, or that's just not sweet enough. And so I will be adding in sugar or maple syrup or whatever to sweeten it up, because I'm like, I know that it doesn't taste particularly sweet to me. And so it's going to taste even less sweet to a 5-year-old. And so the goal is that I want him to drink it, but also enjoy it. And so let's kind of stack the deck in my favor of making this most likely.
And that's another scenario to me where it's kind of all or nothing with things like sugar for example, a lot of yogurt has a lot of sugar in it, but then you see advice on Instagram, well, do plain Greek yogurt, and that's quite bitter. And it's like, we don't have to do, all or nothing with sugar either. We can find a balance with these things. And sugar is probably, alongside protein, I just want to mention sugar real quick, if I can help reassure parents. I do not believe that sugar is addictive. And the research, you probably have shows on this, but we can refer to that. But there's so much panic about sugar, and this sense that, well, if I let them have sugar now, they'll be sugar fiends and, won't be able to control themselves. And I do see kids who are really sweets preoccupied, and they are binging, and they are sort of sneaking in when they have access. The second grader who came to our house to bake cookies, who wasn't allowed sugar at home, sat on the counter spooning sugar from our sugar bowl into her mouth. And so I see this so often, that with that permission and rotating those foods into those regular meal and snack times, that kids learn to trust that they will get them and manage them, and that preoccupation goes away. So it looks like an addiction. It can feel like it, but it's not a physiological addiction. And so, again, I think a lot of the worry and concern around sugar and fruit juice, it's tied into weight bias and diet culture. And, I just read another review study of dozens of studies that looked at fruit juice and said, no, there's no link between higher weight and fruit juice in children. And yet people treat fruit juice like it's a cigarette for children. And really that feeding from a place of worry and anxiety and avoidance generally gets kids and families into trouble with food.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think we're on the same page in regards to sugar. So the final step then is strengthen and support oral, motor, and sensory skills.
Right. And so that's written more for parents of the kids who have the sensory motor problems like we talked about earlier. So, if you have the child like I described who's 2 or 3 and only eating really those soft foods or has other red flags, then working with a speech therapist or occupational therapist And oftentimes it's really just getting ideas for what is appropriate to serve with their skill level, and then what things to serve next, and then pointing out progress. And, oh yeah, look, now we're seeing a bit more tongue lateralization or lip closure around the spoon. And so if there are those red flags, I believe working with someone who's using a responsive approach to those issues can be very helpful. And if you see someone who's telling you you have to do these desensitization brushes where you're, putting the brush in their mouth and the child screaming and fighting, basically if you're asked to do something that makes your child more anxious, upset, gagging more, it's probably not a responsive approach and probably not going to ultimately be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say the part with this that might be, or that might be appropriate for everyone is just, I got the sense of like, how do you make food more fun? And especially if someone has had a situation where food has been connected to something fearful or unenjoyable, like how do you bring it back so that food is no longer attached to being something fearful? And so you gave different examples in terms of like filling a box with rice, and so kids can then play with the rice and have toys in the rice, or just like all of these different things that start to bring back a different relationship with food.
Yes. Yeah. And so again, if that is felt to be needed, I do think that working with someone could be helpful. But yeah, having positive experiences, and sometimes if there are sensory differences, is maybe what will help them have that positive experience is going on a swing right before a meal, or bouncing, or it may not have anything to do with food at all.
Yeah.
And prizing the child's autonomy is what helps them have those positive experiences. And I think also I just want to caution that authentic play is different than adult directed play. So if you are saying, okay, we've had this really tough start, my child had a feeding tube, or we had this horrible experience with the feeding therapy where he was restrained and, it was really bad, and now we're working on making it pleasant again. I think that you can have play with food, but I think again, if it's like, oh, we're going to have this printout sheet, and then I'm going to cut apples, and we're going to make stamp art, and we're going to paint with ketchup and finger paint with these things. Sometimes, even if it's playful, it can still feel like pressure to the child. So going to like do a you pick, if you have that opportunity where they can go pick blueberries, or, if they want to smear whipped cream around because they're having a piece of cake, that's fine, or whatever it is. But I think just being careful that sometimes therapies that say, well, we do play or sensory play, it can still feel like pressure to the child. So that's the responsive piece of, is my child actually like really excited about this, or just kind of complying and going through the steps? So
Yeah.
Again, there's nuance.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm blanking on the name of the book, but I will mention it in the intro or in the show notes, all about attachment play that we found to be incredible. We've used it with our son, and
Wonderful.
just all these different games to kind of have the child in a lot of ways have that autonomy and have points where they feel more in control. And it's been great.
I absolutely love that. And I want to mention that, with my colleagues, is that often the first step they're doing is repairing what can sometimes in these extreme situations be a very fraught relationship, that when feeding is not going well, it can bleed out into the greater relationship. And I've had parents say, well, my kid hates me. All I do is try to cram food into him. And meanwhile, dad gets to do the bedtime story, and he doesn't run to me for comfort. And so when there's been a lot of stress and conflict, I love that example of just attachment games and focusing on that relationship first. And I interviewed an OT who, Suzanne Stratford, and she said, as OTs, I think particularly around food work, it's not so much the sensory-based food play or mindful eating exercises. That isn't where the gold is. It's with exactly what you're talking about, these moments of connection. It's the cuddle, it's the singing, it's the reading the book, and the trust, and having that warm, connected, attuned relationship that then continues into the feeding relationship. Because I see so many parents who, they're gentle parenting, or they're talking about natural consequences, and they'll offer choices to children, up until they get to the table and the child refuses the chicken. And then it's like somehow food is different. There's an anxiety. There's all this baggage there, where the same parent who before was very collaborative and responsive, now when food is there, it turns into a 40-minute battle over 2 bites of chicken and the hostage of the strawberry ice cream, and the child's miserable and the parent's miserable. And so I love that you have that book and just bringing that same collaborative, respectful, authoritative. It's still, the parent offering those safe boundaries and structure while supporting the child's autonomy within that structure. So I love that you brought that up, because that's often where we start when there's been really profound challenges with that feeding relationship.
Yeah, definitely. And it was, for us, when we started using that, we had struggles with Ramsey trying to go to nursery, and it completely backfired. And when we then started to use the examples in the book and to really have attachment play be a lot of the way that we were parenting over a couple of month period, his eating changed a lot, and him wanting to come to the table and being happy to be at the table changed a lot. And it was we didn't put any focus whatsoever on the actual eating part, but it was just a natural consequence of the rest of the relationship changing.
Oh, I love that. I'm excited to read the book. And, having an almost 17-year-old, I often think, I wish I'd had that when she was 3 or 4. And so it is wonderful that there's so much more that we talk about. And it's so important to note this isn't blaming parents, especially in the eating disorder world. It's almost like the word attachment is, many in the eating disorder world have this huge negative reaction, because it's almost back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where everything was blamed on mothers. If it's an eating disorder, it's the mother's fault, and it's attachment this. And so I love that we're bringing back relationship and attachment in a way that is empowering parents to have this mutually satisfying relationship that supports children to do their best with eating. But it's not blaming parents. I was a doctor giving feeding advice, and I got really stuck in this anxious, counterproductive pattern. And I just am really grateful that I found the information I did when I did. So I think it's lovely that you are bringing that up, and that it's really that relationship. And feeding is part of the parenting responsive relationship. It's not separate, and we don't have to somehow treat eating as wholly different from other things in terms of our philosophy around parenting.
Yeah. And so the final thing that I want to ask, and this kind of just connects to this and sort of closes the loop on something we mentioned earlier, which is responsive feeding therapy. So you said there are some values that would be useful just to mention.
Yes, yeah, and we've kind of touched on all of them. And the first 3 values are my co-author and founder with RF Pro, Jo Cormack. She's a brilliant PhD psychologist, and we've talked about the basic needs theory that humans need 3 things ideally to thrive, and that's having autonomy, having relationships or relatedness, and a sense of competence. And again, the sense of competence will be different. We can have a child who has neurodevelopmental differences who can still feel competent in their environment. So it's not as much sort of measured competence. So Those are the 3 big ones: autonomy, relationships, and that sense of competence. And that then gives rise to the 4th value, which is intrinsic motivation. We want children to eat because of all those internal drives that we talked about, not to please or, cheese off the adults in their lives, and or for other things, that external reasons that might come in. And then the final value is really using a whole child lens of looking at the child in their situation. Was there food insecurity? is there a parent with either an active or a history of an eating disorder that's impacting, the parent's ability to show up, and the parent might be struggling with and need support themselves, because nothing will push our buttons and trigger old issues as much as a child's with growth or eating differences. And then looking at, how the ability or the situation around cooking or meal planning, or the cultural differences, the grandparents, what's happening at daycare, which of course we didn't even get into, but that school and daycare is another whole area with a lot of external messaging coming in that's not helpful. So those are sort of the 5 values, with autonomy, relationship, competence, the whole child lens, intrinsic motivation, that helps us look at each child in their family as a unique situation and find responsive ways to have an environment that helps them do their best with eating. And that's kind of a nutshell.
Nice. Well, yeah, as I said, I think it ties into everything we've chatted about. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people go if they want to find out more about you?
So my website is thefeedingdoctor.com. I'm on Instagram, Katja Rowell, my first and last name, MD. Facebook has changed its platform, and I now find it confusing. So I will just admit that I'm not very active on Facebook, but kind of Instagram and my website. And if you're a professional, Responsive Feeding Pro has training. And then I have the books, just finishing the 2nd edition of the Love Me, Feed Me for adoptive and foster parents. But really, I've used it with a lot of clients with food preoccupation. That's kind of my go-to book for that concern. And then my co-author and I also wrote a book for teenagers and adults. So if you're an adult with selective eating and want to explore your own eating, we wrote a book called Conquer Picky Eating for Teens and Adults. And that's a workbook.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes. And thank you once again for coming on. This has been great.
It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
So that was my conversation with Katja. If you have a child and you have any concerns about feeding, then I highly recommend checking out her books. Even though we covered a lot in this episode, there was just so much that we didn't get to go over, and she provides just such sound and sane advice. So the recommendation that I have this week is for a book. I recently read the biography of John Peel by Mike Wall. And John Peel was a DJ on Radio 1 in the UK. He passed away in 2004. And I actually never got to hear him on the radio. So the first time I heard his name was in 2005 when I went to Glastonbury Festival, and they had changed one of the stages to the John Peel stage. And so I found out a little about him at this point. And then I think I bought the book, like his biography, a while ago. It was some point over the last decade, but I just never got round to reading it until now. And he was the longest serving of the original BBC Radio 1 DJs, broadcasting from 1967 until his death in 2004. And he was a DJ who championed new music, and music that really no one else would play. And many bands and artists are lucky that he was around, because without him, they wouldn't have had the careers that they did. He was responsible for the popularity of bands like The Clash and The Undertones and The Smiths, and was really at the forefront of the whole punk scene. And he had this incredibly diverse range of musical interests that continued right up until his death. So whether it was left field electronica, reggae, indie, extreme metal, British hip hop, like he loved it all. And I really enjoyed the book, like learning about someone who, if I'd been born in the UK and lived here my whole life, I think I would have had a huge amount of fondness for him and would have listened to his show. But I didn't move here until 2003 and just didn't listen to the radio at that point. And he passed away in 2004. So if you are into music, it is definitely worth checking out. It is called John Peel by Mike Wall. So that's it for this week's show. As I mentioned at the top, I'm currently taking on new clients. If you want help with an eating disorder or disordered eating, chronic dieting, poor body image, exercise compulsion, getting your period back, any of the topics that I cover as part of the show, then please reach out. You can head over to 7-health.com/help, and there you can find more information. I will be back next week with another episode. Take care, and I'll catch you then.